you're Japanese, right about now, cherry blossom is really special to you, right? You're viewing cherry blossom, you might be drinking sake and thinking, it's the most beautiful thing. And if you're a samurai, cherry blossom is definitely important. And it got me thinking. I actually developed this model a year ago, last time the cherry blossom was out. And I thought then that when I read literature, it tended to point to the case that there was just culture. You read business literature and they say organizational culture or national culture. You read anthropology or cultural studies and they talk about tribes and subcultures. And so there were literature that was pulling me in all sorts of directions, and I thought, well, maybe it's actually a blend of those things. Maybe culture is such that depending on where you are or what company you're in, they can overlap. So some people are just very nationalistic. That would be right on the end of that petal there. That's it. You are just nationalistic. Other people are nationalistic and they're also very local as well. I know the Malaysians tend to have a twin or even a triple track policy, right? Being Muslim, being Malaysian, being from your region. Are you from Surabaya? Are you from PJ? You know, from Terengganu? You know, they'll say people from Terengganu are what, more conservative, are they, Professor? Yeah, more conservative, right? And what else did I learn? They put a lot of sugar on their food. They put sugar on their yam. Or they put cheese on their fried banana. No cheese. No cheese? Okay. No, it's somewhere else, right? So the idea is then that culture some people could be really cultural and pulled in all sorts of cultural directions because they work in a company that has its own corporate culture. Their department has its own culture. They themselves have a personal desire or need to be part of a tribal culture. Now, for some of you, what could that tribal culture be? You could be into punk music, part of a hijabers movement or hijabista or whatever you want to call yourself, hijabis, ninjabis. And in a local borough, part of that culture. So if I come to this part of the world in Southeast Asia, you could be really, really, really cultural. And that would be completely different than, say, in another part of the world or another community where those things don't matter. But I think that why culture is important is because actually that makes or breaks whether you get on. You can study business to any degree, but people are the thing that decide whether a company works or a product gets to market. You know, think about all of those great brands and those great products that have been created, but they never worked. By work, what I mean is consumers didn't purchase them. So, you know, one of the challenges that Microsoft had was that they were too late bringing the tablet to market, even though they developed a tablet, I think it was in 2002. But they hadn't capitalized on it, and everyone was talking about iPads. And this had a big effect on the Surface tablet. So cultures are created, they're organic, they're fluid. And I'm going to put forward one hypothesis or argument. When I read a lot of literature, it would tell me that there is Islam, which is pure, and there is culture. And then there's nationalism and all these sorts of things. What if I was to say to you, and I'm not saying that this is, you know, something that you have to believe in, but at least for the objects of philosophical, Socratic discussion, what if I was to say to you that Islam is culture? As a human being, how can we differentiate or distinguish between Islam and culture? Islam is culture. Whether that's on a macro level, on a local level, on a day-to-day practice, what if I was to say Islam is culture? Basically what I'm suggesting is that we accept that because of our own limitations, or because we are human, and because we are creation, it's a culture that we have to learn, and we have ownership of, and we, in a positive way, as opposed to trying to think what you separate, and then the end result is, well, no further forward necessarily. The debate becomes about separating culture from this thing. So I'm going to suggest to you, what if you can't separate culture from things? What if it always resonates in our mind? No matter how hard we try, the oak tree will always be that wise tree, much wiser than the weeping willow, or the willow that makes our cricket bats, or the coconut tree, or any of these things. So, point to consider number one. What if everything is culture? Now, moving on from that, I then thought about some of the literature that I read specifically concerning Islam. And one of my ways to try and understand Islam for a business application was to look at maps, to look at geography, to look at cultural norms and practices and objects. And I started to think that all Islamic norms, in some way, seem to be taken forward or governed by urbanites, people that were concerned with creating cities, sources of knowledge, businesses, mosques, communities, architecture. More recently, I suppose, in the Gulf, if you look, you can see all of the skyscrapers being built. But the idea was that when I started to look at some of the key people involved in Islamic history, including the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they were urbanites. They came from cities. And that tended to be the case, that the people from urban areas were then driving the consumption practices and patterns of people in rural settings. Now, you might think, so what? So what? Because when I looked at literature, I noticed that a lot of it would talk about the idea of the nomad. This romantic idea of, think about the traditional stereotypical Hollywood depiction of the Arab in the desert. The flowing robes, the sands, the camels, the falcons, all of these things, right? The desert wind going, yeah? Looking for water, the oasis. Romantic. A romantic view, perhaps, because actually, if you go back and look at some of the history, was it the case that people lived in cities and would go to the country to remind themselves of what it was like not to have, or to toughen people and have them less reliant upon some of the finer things in life, some of the objects? In the same way, some of you might go to the country, or you might learn how to, can anyone fish here? Do you go fishing? No fisher people? Fishermen, fisherwomen? Yeah, one or two. Okay, fishing is good, right? Yeah? Fishing, sailing? Sailing, right. Yeah. Fishing. Maybe you do other things, right? Growing vegetables? No? What are you laughing at me for? Why is that so funny? Right. Because they're so dirty, aren't they? Think about, how different people's perceptions would be. I think I'm reminded of, especially in the UK, people buy their meat pre-packed. I'm going to the halal conference in a couple of days. But you think to yourself, how many people actually get to see the animal, have to pluck the feathers from the chicken, see the poor chicken's head looking at? How many people would be vegetarians then? How many of you would not finish your plates? So the idea was that within Islamic culture, there was the concept of this romantic view of the nomad, because actually there's a lot of symbolism attached within Islam of the nomad, not being too attached to your possessions, traveling from place to place. And we know that there were companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that were buried in China. One of the oldest mosques is in China. People then had this view that they had to be not too grounded in one area, not too precious about objects and artifacts, to have a balance. But within that balance, I'm going to suggest that there are two polar scales, orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Orthodoxy in the sense of what? Conservatism, right? So if we think about the orthodoxy side, we can think that Islam has been very good at preserving the language of Arabic. Arabic is central to Islam. Compared with, say, other religions, the entry requirement is quite tough if you want to be a Muslim, right? You have to learn how to read Arabic, you have to learn Surah Fatiha, you have to learn basic elements, which if you've not done it before, you think, it's pretty difficult. Compared to, say, if you wanted to be a Christian, you wouldn't necessarily have to learn another language. So the entry requirement is quite tough. But within that orthodoxy, it's helped to cement the Muslim community together, because once you have those skills, you can go anywhere in the world, right? And you can fit in. I'm sure that you've all traveled to lots of different countries. And whichever country you go to, then prayer is pretty much the same, right? So that's when you think, yeah, it was worth it. The training was worth it. I did it, and now I have this currency, this social currency. I can go anywhere in the world, and I can pray like them. And then for that moment, you feel that bond. In the same way as for some of you that have been to Mecca before, you really feel that bond. You forget that the person is from Iran or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Indonesia or all of these countries. For a second, maybe, you think, wow, what a big family. Now, this orthodoxy then traces its way back to the Abrahamic faiths, all the way back to the beginning. And this is a central pillar of religious belief. On the other side, however, is heterodoxy, revolution. Because it wasn't all about just following the rules, right? Did the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, follow the rules of his community? Did he do as his dad said? Did he do as his family members said, his uncles or whoever? There were times when he didn't, right? So, one of the challenges probably that we both face is, for a lot of the people in this room, you'd have been born into some really amazing families, right? Born into Muslim families, and you're all very well behaved and you're polite. And it then means that when you read the scriptures and it says, do as your parents say, then you say, of course, And life might be quite easy for some of you. For others that were not born into Islam, then it poses challenges, right? Because, can you imagine what it's like if you decide to be a Muslim and your parents, who are also just as nice and amazing, say, son, don't do it? Poses a challenge, right? What do you do? Revolution, heterodoxy. So at key moments within Islamic civilization, there have been periods when people have had to make a change, whether that's go against their family, go against their community, go against ethnic ties, whatever your cultural frame of reference is. Islam has encouraged people to do that, has empowered people to do that. And now, if we think, I remember, your Prime Minister mentioning at the World Islamic Economic Forum, it was last year, it was in October. So he came to London, and he gave the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's first wife, who was, Khadija. Peace be upon her too. Was she older or younger than the Prophet Muhammad? Older. Older. How much older? 15 years? Do we have higher than 15 years? How old was he? So older than 15? Less than? Okay. Older, right? Hands up how many guys are married to somebody old who's 10 years older than them? Any guys married to someone 10 years older than them? No. What about that practice? What about that sunnah? Does anyone want to keep that sunnah up? No. Okay. So I want you to think about culturally how that would be viewed. Be honest about some of the things that we see within our own traditions. We have examples. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his wife Khadija, she was his boss, right? Before they got married. How many guys have married their boss? Why are you laughing? I know why you're laughing. But think about it. I'm not encouraging you to go out tomorrow and ask your boss to marry, if you could. But think about the reality and think about the difference. Think about perhaps even today how revolutionary that would be. Probably if you said that to your, for the guys in the room, if you went back and told your mum, I want to marry this lady, she's my boss, she's 20 years older than me. Your mum might give you a slap, right? But think about some of those things because they're within our history, and those are the things that perhaps have led to revolutionary change and have brought us to where we are today. Think about it. It's kind of crazy. If you take a step back and think about this is your country, this is your islands, these are your coconuts, and think about the fact that you have this religion from Arabs in the desert. You're learning Arabic? What am I doing here? I'm Scottish. I wear a kilt. We play the bagpipe. But it means that you want to come here and I want to come here. And even if it's not your religion, there's something there that's making you think, well, what is this thing? Who's this guy Muhammad? Why is he so important to 2 billion people, or how many ever there are, that say that they're Muslim? What role does a guy have in business? And then they tell me that Jesus is part of this party too. How does that work? These Muslims are claiming everything. This brand Islam is taking our people from us too. So we have mapped out then a whistle-stop tour where if I was explaining to a business audience, what does Islam mean to Muslims? Well, it's about trying to balance evolution, revolution, orthodoxy, heterodoxy, all of these things, and getting them to drive urban generation, right? Urban change. Now, geography, I said, was important to me, and looking at the map. So if we look at the map, according to the Pew Research Center, they say that this is where all of the Muslims are. The darker the map, the more Muslims there are there, right? Now, if you look at Ogilvy, or Ogilvy Noor, the advertising agency that specializes in Islamic marketing, they will do a projection looking at the map there. So if we look at this part of the world, is getting quite fat, right? All the Nessie Lemak is paying off. This part of the world is getting fat. We can see that then the Muslim experience is especially important in Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. We can also look at brand finance, saying that in the Middle East, the demand for Sharia-compliant products has grown up. Brand values have gone up by 78% in 2010. Apparently, there are 1.8 billion Muslims globally. It seems to be the same number for year on year, right? But I think there are probably a few more. But one of the things that we can see is that 52.5% are under the age of 24, or, you know, if you want to say, I think it's under 60% under the age of about 25 or something. You know, the stats say that basically there are lots of Muslims, and there are going to be more because they've got a young population and they have lots of kids. Well, the ones in the East maybe, not so many in the West. But population figures are growing. And most recently I learned, for example, that there's a city, the second largest city in France called Marseille, which is in the southwest coast. The population, Muslim population there is 1/3. 1/3 of people in Marseille are Muslim. And they reckon that quite soon it could be the first Muslim majority city in Western Europe. Wow. UK is pretty good too, right? Census figures are stating, if you go back to my article, that there are lots of people converting to Islam, there are lots of people coming to live, there are lots of people having babies. These things are only going to increase. So if I put my business hat on, I would suggest to you, any business person, that if you've got so many people and such a big audience, why is there so little information? Why is there so little data? Why are there so few articles or few discussions about such a large population? It's changing, of course, and we're all part of that change. But then if we think about some of the books about China, they say, oh, the Chinese, 1 billion Chinese people. You know, this is the next economy, or 1 billion Indian people. But then if we look, you know, you've got about 160 million Muslims in India, right? More than Pakistan at the minute, I think. Not more than Pakistan. No one's got anything more than Pakistan, right? Pakistan will, I think, according to Pew, they will become the largest Muslim majority country. They will overtake Indonesia. Pakistan's in the bud. Not that it matters, because Indonesia's got how many? About 208 million Muslims out of 245 million people, and what, 17,500 islands, or 22,000, depending on whether the tide is up or down. But yeah, I learned that in Jakarta in December, right? But what we do know is the numbers are big. And then if we look in China, the interesting thing is that some reports say there are about 20 million Muslims in China, or others will say, oh, there's 100 million Muslims, you know, so we're talking give or take quite a few percent. But we can see that there are large numbers of people on who we know very little about. Very little about. Lots of countries, lots of geographies, lots of culture. And then, don't overlook the fact that if people are converting to Islam, does that, you know, think about if you're English or Irish or Polish or something and you choose to be a Muslim, does that mean that your DNA changes and suddenly you like spicy food? Right? So why is it then that so many Muslims, so many people take the shot and become Muslim and the first thing they're given is spicy food? Right? So I don't like spicy food, oh, go on, eat it. I remember seeing one person take a shahada and they were given chicken biryani as a almost like a reward. Let's celebrate, have some chicken biryani. And she said, I'm a vegetarian. and they looked at her and said, don't be stupid. Just eat this, eat the chicken. It's good for you. So we've got people from different backgrounds and different geographies, each of which have different consumption habits. We might be similar, but we're also different. there's local and there's global culture. And in the article, I'd extend that in saying that Theodore Levitt from Harvard mentioned it was in 1983 that globalization would do what? Make us all kind of the same. Production costs would go down, there'd be mass consumerism, and we would all be able to have access to the same objects. But one of the things that I've noticed from other literature, especially around about now, the past 4 years or so, it's said that people are becoming more cultural. Globalization is not making us the same. Globalization maybe is making us think, how can we still stand out in a world where everybody is talking? If you look on Facebook profiles, LinkedIn profiles, Twitter handles, all of these things, I don't think there's very much of everyone looking the same. In fact, there seems to be a big drive for people trying to stand out, and that's a very good indication of actually what happens when you put everybody together, right? We all want to maintain some form of identity. So we have this world, and we have all of the news headlines that talk about the Muslims. The Muslims are coming. The Muslims are here. The Muslims eat meat and money. The Muslims like to save their money in Sharia-compliant places. They like to eat halal meat. The Muslims like to do lots of things. The Muslims being this big population. But then are Malay Muslims the same as Indonesian Muslims? Yes and no, right? Are Malay Muslims the same as Yemeni Muslims? Yes and no, right? Are Malay Muslims the same as Muslims from Brooklyn, New York? Yes and no, right? You say no. Have you been to Brooklyn? You've seen some movies, because you have to believe the movies, right? So that would mean that if I watched Nasi Lemak 2.0, right, that would give me an insight into Malaysian culture. That's all I need, Nasi Lemak 2.0. Now, if we look at some of the stats then, business textbooks will tell us about BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India and China. And then there's civets, and there's Mint. So I thought to myself, okay, let me look at these population figures, and these are from the Pew Research Center as well, because I got used to looking at this information and saying, okay, yep, the BRIC markets. But then I thought, well, where did the Muslims fit in that? And actually, if you look, in 2001, we looked at BRIC, and more recently, there have been these other acronyms that have come into fashion. Look at the Muslim populations. The emerging economies, then, are showing you that these emerging economies have higher population figures with Muslims in them. So then I started to think to myself, it's not just you see Islam is the truth, or you see we're really important, but you see we actually know very little. There isn't enough research that's going on. And even when people see the data and see that these things are happening, you know, if anyone is researching in this area, I still maintain that it's still quite hard to disseminate ideas and findings based upon these. And if we look at even brand values and corporate identity and lots of subjects that I studied, I thought there doesn't seem to be a fair reflection of case studies within these representative of population figures. Part of my journey was reading a book in about 2008 that asked me how global was I, based upon how many countries I'd been to relative to the population figures. So if I hadn't been to China and India, then I wasn't very global, because that was where most of the people were in the world. So I made sure that I went to China and India. So likewise, if you look at your business books, how many case examples are there of brands from India, from China, from Indonesia? I can speak from editing an academic journal. Hardly any articles on Indonesia. And this is the journal specializing in Islamic marketing. How many articles from Pakistan? Not enough. India, not enough. China, not enough. So there are loads of countries and geographies that are not being represented. And there are population figures that are suggesting to everybody that there's a big community of people who can be defined within a segment or being an audience, but they're not being measured, or they're not being assessed, or they're not being spoken to. So, it's also happening outside of the Muslim world as well. These are adverts taken from my hometown in London. This was part of a London Underground tube campaign. The lady who's a barrister. So there are communities And we have another one here from that West Bank where they're celebrating multicultural Britain. You can see what the symbolism is saying there. This is big news all over the place. I was saying before my talk today as well, my local mosque was a pub. But it was disused and some Muslims bought it and turned it into a mosque. There was another pub a couple of miles down the road and somebody bought it, gave away the alcohol license, and what do you think they would do with it? Well, of course, they turned it into a shisha and smoothie bar. What would any Muslim entrepreneur do wanting to target young Muslims, right? It's got to be a smoothie and shisha bar with a stage so that you can have nasheed artists or poets being able to express their political views and tell everyone how hard it is to find a husband, how hard it is to find a wife, how hard it is to keep my uncle happy, how hard I work. But joking aside, I'm suggesting to you then that there's a phenomenon that's going all over the world. And this is something then that is increasing in importance. Now, it's also, for all of the reasons I've stated, I mean, they all tend to be positive. This is some graffiti taken from the walls of Egypt. Can anyone speak Arabic? La taharrath. Which means?
Against harassment, no harassment.
Yes! If I had a prize, I'd give you a prize. No to harassment. So this lady is spraying all of these guys away. This is her man repellent spray, right? Because one of the things that was happening during the Arab Spring was this, the increased case of harassment. So I want you to think that whilst there are all of these things going on, you've got people converting to Islam, you've got consumerism, you've got halal, you've got Islamic finance, you've also got some real problems that need to be addressed, that need to be discussed, and for very good reasons. It's not just the case that the media is trying to paint a negative picture. There are some really important things that if they're not debated and discussed, then it leads to problems. Now, this new black thing, what did I mean? Yeah, what did I mean? Did I mean Malcolm X? Did I mean Yusuf Islam? Did I mean the Afghan girl? Did I mean Muhammad Ali? Did I mean these guys from New York? Or did I mean this very nice English gentleman who thought that he would impress his wife by dressing like a Muslim? From what I understand in this painting, this is actually, this is a bit of cosplay. This is back in the day. Does anyone know what cosplay is? Any manga fans here? Right, okay, so if you're not a manga, do you know the idea of dressing up in costumes? Right? Okay. From what I understand, and please forgive me if I've made a mistake, this painting was portraying this idea that people became, fascinated with what Muslims were like. It was exotic, right? Just like it might be a bit exotic, to wear, I don't know, an Italian